Hello everyone, welcome back to another one of our anime Bible studies. Today we're going to be discussing the biblical themes in Yona of the Dawn. There are three sections in which I'd like to draw biblical parallels for you all, in which we'll be discussing not just the historical background for Yona of the Dawn itself, but also the historical information we're given in the Bible and how it parallels to the events in Yona of the Dawn, as well as some theological themes as well. As we're going to be discussing all of those, I'd like to first start to set the mood, so to speak, to give you an idea of where we're going to be concluding with all of this, to the book of Colossians chapter 1, verses 26 through 27, where we read, "The mystery which has been hidden from ages and from generations, but now has been revealed to his saints. To them God willed to be made known what are the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles." Okay, so a lot of hype. What is this mystery that's basically been built up since the foundations of the Old Testament, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory? Now, for those of you who don't know, Christ, or in Greek, Messiah, is a title. It's not Jesus' last name. It's just what he's being referred to. He's the fulfillment of a promise that was made all the way back at the beginning of when mankind was first separated from God. I trust you guys are familiar with the Adam and Eve account. We won't be going into that history here today. If you have questions about the information and are kind of new to this whole Christianity thing, please leave them in the comments below. Sincerity will be matched with clarity. But among all these things that we're going to be discussing today, we'll discuss the least to the most relevant, the interesting to the important. The first thing that I'd like to draw as far as parallels to biblical relevancy in Yona of the Dawn is that Yona of the Dawn was based historically, and I know I'm going to mispronounce this, the Goguryeo, it's Goguryeo in English lettering, kingdom, which was the last real structured kingdom that was established before China ended up taking over the region of Korea in around the 6th century AD. Now, what's interesting about this, and not really anything relevant to the study, but worth mentioning, was that when this kingdom was established, the events of Yona of the Dawn would have taken place in history around the same time that Jesus was on this earth. And also, interestingly, the economic plans that were enforced to kind of give that kingdom its power were very closely modeled after the thing that made Egypt a world ruling power during the time of Joseph in the book of Genesis. So, neat. Not much else to say. If you are a history buff, that information might be useful to you. But going on into a more concise historical comparison, let's talk about Yona of the Dawn itself. History is basically the majority of what constitutes the Bible. The Old and New Testament, these things are just recording for us as men witnessed the events that they were living in as God spoke and moved in their midst. And the focus is on God's plan for mankind's redemption. Now, 2 Samuel covers historically the reign of King David in Israel, and what's called the greatest king that Israel ever had. And just like all historical accounts about someone's life, they're going to tell us about the good, the bad, and the ugly. David had an exemplary relationship with God. He wrote the majority of the Psalms, and what's also interesting was he established Israel's capital. To this day, what is known as Jerusalem. David is the one who conquered and established that city under Israel's flag. But this was also contrasted by the honest reality that while David accomplished some great things, he was also a very poor father. He wasn't perfect. No one is but Jesus himself. And, well, he had many wives. Let's just put it that way. Despite God's warning that this was a very bad idea, as a result, he had many kids from different women. And 3 of these kids are relevant to the comparisons we'll be drawing here today to Yona of the Dawn. 2 sons, 1 daughter. The sons' names are Amnon and Absolom. And the daughter's name is Tamar. Now, Tamar, if you're wondering, let me just clarify this. Don't expect her to become some, BA, elite archer, red dragon queen chick. No, that doesn't happen. But nonetheless, when we're talking about this biblical relevancy, I want you to catch this account and start squinting a little bit. Look for some biblical themes that you might be seeing in line with Yona the Dawn. I'll go through the Bible event in summary, and I encourage you to read it on your own time, but keep the plot of Yona the Dawn in mind, especially the first 2 episodes. Amnon was David's oldest son, and heir to the throne. Absolom and Tamar were both siblings from the same mother. Amnon was from a different mother, so they were relatives through David, but not through their mom. Amnon, being the spoiled prince that he was, apparently found his sister attractive. Now, that's creepy, but not necessarily a crime until you start going to your friends and realize that Amnon surrounded himself with the wrong kind of people that you want to get input from if you find yourself in this kind of situation. And they helped him basically plot a scheme, basically, to plan a plan to take advantage of Tamar. And he went through with it. He acted on it. A brother assaulted his sister. Now, this is where David should have stepped in. And instead of dealing with his son for a crime rightly deserving of death, David was still bearing the guilt of a similar choice that he made, not with his sister, but with the wife of one of his best soldiers, Bathsheba. Now, you are probably familiar with that. If you're not, I'll give you the summary in the comments if you ask. But just passing over that event, understand David's got his own relationship issues to work out and doesn't feel like he has any right to say anything. So he doesn't. Meanwhile, Amnon has just literally gotten away with rape. Tamar has still been raped. And Absolom, big brother Absolom, is comforting his sister and looking at Amnon with those eyes. He begins plotting to take matters into his own hands and enact the justice that he just isn't seeing from his father David. Necessary conflict, right? Someone's blood needs to be shed, and rightly so, but he wants to pursue peace. Sound familiar? Amnon is eventually taken on a hunting trip with his little brother Absolom, and Absolom murders him in cold blood. It was premeditated, it was intentional, and it was not in the context of a fair trial and under the legal jurisdiction that God laid out for his nation. So, Amnon's now a murderer. And David should have stepped in here. But once again, what do you think happens? This whole thing is my fault. I have no right to say anything. It's my cause. Amnon, his blood's on my hands, not Absalom's. If anyone deserves to be punished for this, it's me. But then likewise, you murdered my heir. This is like the kind of stuff that happens when you're trying to take over a kingdom. You murder all your siblings and then go after your dad. People were nervous. They thought that's what Absalom was going to do. It wasn't at first. But when Absolom saw that his dad wasn't doing anything even about his own actions of murder, premeditated, first-degree murder, he starts to see a trend here. We're not getting justice from David, not with my sister, and certainly now not with my half-brother. And that's when the wheels start turning in Absalom's head and saying, you know what? I'm going to make sure this never happens again. I'm going to do the job, David, that you never would. I'm going to become king. But does he do it right away? No. He starts playing the good politician. He starts making friends with people, with leaders throughout the tribes of Israel. And he starts gaining favor and making good decisions. And, like, oh, you need that problem solved? Well, my dad, he's too busy doing whatever he does up there, maybe playing his harp or something. Why don't I handle your legal case? And, maybe, hopefully, when my dad gets up there in years, I'll encourage your vote. And it's just like, you're a good kid. I'd like to have you as king. And he's just dropping hints here and there. He's playing it smart. But Absalom builds up this favor, and when he has basically the heart of the nation behind him, it is then that he stages a coup d'etat. And David has to flee the capital, Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting about this as well is that when he stages this rebellion and David has to go into hiding, more on that in a moment, what's very interesting about this is the number one supporter, and this doesn't have relevance to Yona the Dawn, perhaps, but what's interesting about this, you know who Absalom's number one supporter in his uprising against David? It was Bathsheba's father-in-law. So more than one dog came back to bite David in this case, didn't they? So with all of this in mind, 3 parallels I'd like to draw as far as Absalom's parallels to Soo-won in a completely superficial and opinionated stance. You don't have to acknowledge it as anything more than coincidence, but for those who I encourage to engage in personal Bible study and who want to pursue that, if you're familiar with Yona the Dawn, take these parallels in mind so that you know and love the story Yona the Dawn. Keep them in mind as going through 2 Samuel, and you'll start to see and note the tensions historically, the emotions that are geared behind these things that you also likewise saw in this series that we both love. So, first parallel. As a result of neglecting necessary bloodshed to do what was right, Absalom and Soo-won both plotted to murder those that they deemed responsible. Soo-won's father, rightly deserving the throne, right, was neglected. The kingdom suffered, and appalling crimes were tolerated in the name of pursuing peace. Now, did that make King El a bad man? No, but it did mean those decisions had consequences for people, right? Well, Absalom's father also was neglectful. The kingdom also suffered as a result of this injustice being done, and an appalling crime was tolerated in favor of unjust peace. Interesting. The second parallel to Soo-won and Absalom will be, though Soo-won was a capable politician, well, we'll acknowledge that, and a skilled soldier, perhaps not Hawk level, but nonetheless, the ends do not justify the means. He murdered the king. Motivated by a greater good, in his eyes, he made enemies with the Red Dragon. Absalom did the exact same thing. He wanted to pursue justice. He spent years gaining influence in Israel, doing great things for the nation. Yet what drove him was bitterness. And as Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 15 says, "Let not a root of bitterness spring up, and by it many become defiled." Bitterness, resentment, it's been called drinking poison and expecting the person you hate to die. It's just doing damage to yourself. It's not the kind of attitude that any Christian should harbor, because what ended up taking place was murder. And no matter what David did to avoid conflict with his son, what ultimately ended up being the result, Absalom made enemies with the true and living God, and he's the one who ultimately ended up dealing with him. And that's what brings us to the third parallel to Soo-won and Absolom. His failure to kill Yona, right, didn't see her eventually just dying out in the wilderness. She gathered a, 6-man, 5-man, 1-woman, either way, army to defy his reign. And, well, no spoilers on that part. But nonetheless, when it ties to Absalom, after taking the throne, David went into hiding in the mountains of southern Israel, where his best soldiers, now note, David, skilled warrior, right? Joab, who was his nephew. And by the way, if you want a good comparison as far as like what to keep in mind when you hear Joab, just imagine a mentally unstable Huck. Okay? That's what we're talking about here. So David, Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. Isn't that neat? All waited to ambush Absolom, who was tricked into committing a smaller army than he should have to take down these guys and their forces, and ended up being killed by Joab. And by the way, quite brutally. I won't mention it how he did it here, and don't worry, it wasn't anything like crude or anything. I'll say it anyway. Absolom, it was customary for princes, and by the way, that might actually be a fun fact for you as well. Princes in the ancient world, especially in the Middle East, obviously you're related to the king, you don't have to pay taxes. So what they did was, if you wanted to know which guy was a prince, you'd look for the dude with long hair. And every single year, they'd cut off their hair and basically donate it as a resource, and people would treat it as a valuable commodity. This is a prince's hair garment, right? Well, Absolom was described, according to the historical accounts, that his hair was so long, so thick, so lustrous, that when he cut it off every single year, it weighed in the pounds. So I think the long white hair of Soo-won is underestimated when you're looking at the lion's mane that was Absolom. But anyway, what happened was, when he was riding into battle, they got ambushed. They clearly lost the battle. And so Absolom goes running for his life. And he's riding on his donkey. The donkey isn't minding for anyone's concern but his own. He's got something heavy on his back, but granted, if he sees a giant thick underbrush, he'll duck. He doesn't really care necessarily about the guy on his back. You can guess what happens. The tree branch knocks Absolom out, and his huge mullet basically gets caught in this thicket, and he's hanging by his hair. And Joab comes along. Actually, it wasn't Joab. A soldier spies Absolom. He reports it to Joab and reminds him of the orders. David said, "Don't kill him. That's still my boy." Joab doesn't care. He grabs his spears, and he finds Absolom, and he's like, "Hey, cause of all of my problems, huh?" And he takes not one, not two, not three, not, for crying out loud, one would have been enough, but he impales Absolom hanging from a tree by his hair with multiple spears. Overkill if ever I saw it. Hawked to the wind. But anyway, that's all of the historical parallels I'd like to discuss with you, as far as the interesting associations they have with Yona the Dawn. But what I really want to discuss with you guys here today, and what is more or less the most straightforward of all of the points I'd like to make, are not the historical parallels or even the historical background, but the theological. And for those of you who don't know, theology is the study of God, understanding God. And that's what we'll be discussing primarily in this study. The majority of the talking was done in history, but understand, in Yona the Dawn, what was the theology, the understanding of the gods, of God? Well, King Hiryuu, I don't care if I'm not pronouncing it right, I'm not Korean, I don't apologize for that either, the red dragon god, we'll just go with that, voluntarily became human in order to have a relationship with mankind. Follow so far? When he came down, he was eventually rejected, persecuted, and physically killed. The other dragons, the blue, the yellow, the white, the green, they offered to destroy mankind, but he did not allow them to. Why again? Waiting for the red dragon's return, they passed on their blood throughout the generations, giving godlike power to these special warriors for the purpose of protecting and obeying the will of the red dragon upon his return. According to the Bible, the true and living God, the God, Yahweh, the triune creator, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Three separate consciousnesses in one essence or being that is God. This absolutely unique being that is apart from creation, has always existed, the author of life and the definition of love and goodness itself. Voluntarily became a man in a moment of history. The man, Jesus Christ, and who, by the way, was God the Son incarnate. So if you're wondering, well, if God left the throne in heaven, who was running the universe? There's a triunity in the being of God. The Son took on human nature, while the Spirit and the Father remained to keep everything intact. So hopefully that helps. I know it's complicated, but understand, if God can fit into our minds, it probably means that's where he came from in the first place. If there is a true and living God, it's probably going to be a little bit bigger than what we can grasp as finite human beings, as his creation, which by definition will always be lesser than the creator. Just making the point. Oh, and also, if you're wondering, well, don't the Asian religions come before Christianity? Nope. Not in writing, anyway. The accounts that would draw any sort of similarity in Asian mythology, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, you name it, all of these things aren't put into writing. We don't have any actual accounts of them in any semblance to Christianity until after Christianity's influence had spread throughout the world, and they wanted to gain converts but couldn't match up to this account that had so much history behind it. So, borrowing elements, we see parallels, and that's why I love my job, because they've made it so easy for me. But check up on the history. I encourage you to do so. Moving on from this, though, understand that this was predicted in the Old Testament thousands of years beforehand, that he would be rejected, persecuted, and physically killed. But all to serve the purpose of redeeming mankind through the shedding of his, where's the power found again? Blood. As a sacrifice to restore a personal relationship with us and God again. While this was beginning to take place, one of Jesus' earthly followers, what we would call a disciple, tried to defend Jesus. He drew his sword, he was sleep-lagged, but he still tried to go for someone's head, managed to cut off an ear, and Jesus stopped him and reminded him of a very interesting fact. Matthew chapter 26, verse 52. Jesus said to him, "Put your sword into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." That sounds like King Il, doesn't it? "Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled, that it must happen thus?" Peter, remember, this is happening intentionally. Peter, understand, I'm God. I could say the word, and these guys will be uncreated. But also understand as well, Peter, even if I don't even raise a finger, at a word, I've got 12 legions. A Roman legion, in this historical context, is anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers. And according to the accounts in Isaiah, one of those angels was able to wipe out the entire Assyrian army, 185,000 soldiers in one night. And those weren't lousy soldiers, by the way. So literally, Peter, at a word, this world is over. Put that sword down. I'm allowing this to happen for a reason. Don't you think about taking out these people, red, white, and blue dragons. I'm making a joke here. You understand the point that's being made. Don't even think about it. I'm allowing this to happen. And why again? So the first parallel, theologically, in the background of Yona the Dawn. God voluntarily coming down to have a relationship with man. The second parallel, God allowing his physical life to be taken out of love for his creation. And finally, the third parallel, God coming back to this earth again to dethrone evil forever. something the disciples themselves were reminded of. Acts chapter 1, verse 9. When he had spoken these things, and while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. So Jesus ascends into heaven. The final resurrection, the last time they would see him physically on this earth, before heaven. They all looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up. So basically they were just staring and staring and staring, like, is he coming back down yet? You see anything? And behold, 2 men stood by them in white apparel, who also said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus who is taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven. Guys, he gave you orders. Get to sharing the gospel. He's going to be back. Until then, how's God working in our world today? The Holy Spirit indwelling the hearts of those who have accepted Jesus' sacrifice. Not as a command, like Yona and the dragon warriors, but as a relationship. What kind of relationship? Well, once again, look at the dragon warriors. Because of the shedding of Jesus' blood, and from the authority of the Father, the Holy Spirit is with us, and as we read in our opening verse in Colossians, in us. That makes us dragon warriors of a sort, doesn't it? Okay, perhaps not with the same abilities, but nonetheless, a personal relationship with the true and living God. How? Simply accepting the sacrifice that made it all possible. Thank you for your time in listening to the study. If you have sincere questions, leave them in the comments below. Sincerity will always be matched with clarity. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But most importantly, if you know someone who's familiar with Yona the Dawn, but perhaps not the things we've discussed in this study, please feel free to share this study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time in listening to this study. Remember that Jesus loves you, and remember that important thing that we all need to know before anything else. Why did God give his life? Same reason the red dragon allowed his to be taken, because he loves you. If you remember that as a fact, you'll understand not only his involvement in your life, but his continual relationship with you is going to remain unchanging. If he died for you when you were at your worst, how do you think he's going to treat you when you're trying to do your best?